If we no longer have Germany as the industrial heart of Europe, that means Germany is no longer the financial hub that makes Europe happen. Remember that the largest chunk of EU funds comes from Germany. And Germany is not just, the German economic system is not just Germany. It's Belgium and the Netherlands and Austria and Poland and Slovakia and the Czech Republic and Hungary. And without the Germans, none of that works. So the Germans don't provide the funding that is necessary for the EU to function. The Germans don't provide the employment that allows the social model of Europe to function. We're talking about a death blow to the EU that's, an indirect outcome of the war. That this is where this was ultimately going to go. And they are hoping against hope that there's going to be something that happens in the way this all shakes out, whether it's with the Americans, the Russians, or someone else, where they're going to find a way to muddle through. How they do that without the economic model, I don't know, and I don't think they do either. Well, let's start with why we didn't have a famine yet, because it's really, avoiding famine, big deal. Number one, Mother Nature was the kindest she has ever been in recorded history. And every agricultural zone in the world had good weather this last year. Second, the sanctions were designed intelligently. They technically don't touch fertilizer at all. So a lot of the industrial infrastructure in Russia dates back to the 1960s, particularly the petrochemical system that deals with the fertilizer processing. And so we only had reductions of 20 to 40% from the Russian space. And then when the Russians lost the ability to export natural gas, they also lost the ability to export ammonium. So the Europeans, for the most part, have stopped producing nitrogen-type fertilizer themselves because they used Russian inputs. So all of that added up to significant shortages in production globally. But everybody had a reserve. And most countries have now drawn down that reserve. So we're entering this year in a significantly worse position than we did last year, but no one's tank is completely dry yet. I've got some very big concerns for this year. When you're talking about places like Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, not the Middle East. So Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Australia, none of them have any phosphate and none of them have any potash locally except for like Chile. So they really are dependent on exports from this region. But we've had a year. And in that year, a few new suppliers have managed to spin out. Normally it takes 3 years to bring a phosphate or a nitrogen facility online, and about 10 years for potash. And companies and countries have started to increase their output to incrementally take bites out of that. So as long as the Russian stuff doesn't fall off the market in a hot second, this will be relatively contained. But with Nord Stream offline, Europe is no longer part of the solution. And if we get into the spring and natural gas demand picks back up because of China, then a lot of East Asia can't be part of the solution because they use LNG to make natural gas-based nitrogen fertilizer. And the Canadians are doing everything they can to speed up potash development, and they're hoping they can do it in 7 years instead of 10. So we're still right on the edge, and it doesn't take a very creative crisis to tip us into the disaster zone. It's entirely possible. This war is not about economics for the Russians. From their point of view, if they can't reestablish the forward crustal defense that the Soviet Union had, they will disappear from this earth. And they're right. Their demographics are terminal. This was always going to be the last century of the Russian ethnicity. And they feel, and I think rightly, that if they can't forward position, then they're going to be fighting internal rebellions at home, because probably now 1 in 3 Russian citizens is no longer ethnically Russian. And the non-Russian ethnics have very high birth rates, while the Russian ethnics have very low birth rates. So they really do see this as the twilight of their lives, and they're right. So if we get to a position where the Russians feel that the leverage makes sense, of course they'll do it. But from the European point of view, they're not going to force the issue. Absolutely. And bottom line here, the Russian stuff will all go away and never come back. That's cooked in now. The Russian technological base is weak. Their workforce was hollowed out before they started throwing hundreds of thousands of people at this conflict. They're incapable of maintaining their own system, especially when it comes to energy and petrochemicals and mining. A lot of the growth we have seen around the world since 1992 has been about the inclusion of places that didn't participate in the first wave of globalization into the system. There was only one product where Russia was a top 3 producer, and that was oil. Now they're a top 3 producer of over 20 different materials that we all use every day. Without the Russians participating eagerly, this will all go away. The question is whether it's this month, this year, this decade. So we all need to prepare for that one way or another. If Putin is not in power, someone very much like him will be. There was a coup in the Soviet period back in 1982. And at that point, the KGB took over, and that was Chernomyrdin and Andropov and Gorbachev. Putin is the heir to that legacy, which is another way of saying that the only people who are in the political elite in Russia are former KGB officers who trained during the Soviet period. Well, that means they're all in their late 50s or older, and there's only about 130 of them. And they all see the world the same way, and Putin has been able to purge that group over the last 22 years in order to make sure that there are no challengers to the throne. So as long as it's someone from that elite who's in charge, Putin's fine. And even if he wasn't, he died for health reasons, one of his replacements would feel the same way. The only way we should expect a political shift is in Russia is if the military defeat is so catastrophic that you get a revolution. That is traditionally how you see political change in the former Soviet world. And we're just not there yet. There's 2 weak spots here. The first one is on the input side, specifically raw material. So the Russians have one mine that produces 40% of global palladium. There's palladium in every semiconductor. And there is a 2-country supply chain system to produce neon, which is used to focus the apertures of the etching lasers. And for that, the first stage is in Russia, and the second stage was in Ukraine and Mariupol, and that's now gone. So that's conservatively half of global neon is gone. So we know we're going to face a semiconductor crunch where we just can't produce the volume we've become used to until we replace those sources from somewhere else. If there was cheap palladium laying around, we would have done that already. And neon, that's a 2 to 3 year period to build out the physical infrastructure to make it happen. The Koreans have started, the Chinese have started, but it's a race against time. So that's problem one. Problem two is that there's not just one kind of semiconductor, so it gets kind of hairy really quickly. But let's start on the high end, because that's what everybody is concerned about. There are over 6,000 firms globally that are involved in semiconductor fab facilities for the 10 nanometer and better chips. 5,000 of them are involved with a company called ASML, which is a Dutch firm that does the lithography. Most of those 5,000 firms have no global competition. They're highly specialized. They do one thing for ASML, and most of them only have ASML as a customer. See where I'm going here? You miss a few of those pieces, and ASML in its current form cannot function. Now, I am a huge fan of ASML. I think it is the world's best company. Whether it's quality control, managing their supply chain, the technical innovation, the corporate secrecy. Oh my God, they're so good at that. But they are the only company on the planet that makes the lithography machines, which are the most sophisticated machines humans build, for every single one of the fabs that produces the 10 nanometer and better chips. So one piece of that constellation falls out and the whole thing stops. So we don't need a war over Taiwan for this to break down. We need to rebuild the ecosystem in a more sustainable way. And since there are so many pieces to that, this is a multi-year process. So we should count on losing the leading edge chips on a global basis. On the low end, 90 nanometer and worse, the analog chips, the Internet of Things chips, that is 70, 80% within the Chinese system. We should count on losing those too. Now, everything in the middle, the 90 to the 10, like the workhorse chips, most of what we need to do the things that we consider necessary, whether it's aerospace, computers that are not servers, that system is more redundant. That system has more players that have more backup, and there's more competition across the space. I actually think that general area will be fine. But if you want to do Internet of Things, if you want to do electric vehicles, if you want to do automated driving or AI, that we need to write off for a few years. And that is going to be very difficult to build back at scale. Right. But in the worst case scenario, and I don't get to say good.